Anyways, we have Mercury in the fourth house. So Mercury in the fourth house, it comes down to this. So Mercury is the planet of how you think, your thinking process, how you communicate with people. The fourth house has to do with your family, your roots, your past, and how you did things in the past, and moving forward, it's like, those tendencies still, persist essentially. But like it's your connection to your mother as well. It was it great, was it, not so great, but it typically is if you have displacement. And like with displacement as well, your mother had a role in like your the way you like think and like communicate with people. She like emphasized certain things with you. Don't say this type of shit to people, if you're talking to people, be like this, don't ever, take shit at face value. You might have had a mother who was like more of like, making you like think about things, think things through, that type of shit. If you have this type of placement, and it just so happens that I do have this placement, you know, as a Green Angel, I have this placement, so I actually do know about it. So the first sign we're talking about is actually the one I have. So Aries, Mercury in the fourth house. So with this, you might not have like necessarily seen eye to eye with your parents, but you did like basically you came to like common ground and whatever, and you were like you voiced your opinion. You were like, I like this, or I don't, agree with you on this type of thing. I hear you or whatever, but I don't or whatever. Or you were, you always gave your, fucking thoughts on what what was going on in the family. Essentially, is what this is. You always like told them what the fuck was going on, and you told them, this or that. You might not have been like, too detailed about shit, but you like told them like the gist, the main thing. I am doing this, I got to do this. I need your help with this, and you told, you had that kind of connection, with your family, and you still do probably, you know you have, that, right? And then like when you, go out to people, it's more like, you can, be more direct and, talk to them. You ain't telling them too much, but you like giving them like what they need, what they need to know about, a situation. And it's because of your upbringing with your mother, and how she, did shit for you, or your motherly figure, whoever that was. Let's say that, you then had to be like that type of person or whatever. You know gave people, you know, you're like asking them shit. You're like, and you're like the one. You're kind of like, they might have thought you were digging in their ass or something, but you weren't. You were just like, actually showing concern. Like how was school today, brother? Because you didn't have a mother or whatever, right? So you like basically took on that role yourself, of like being a kind of like nurturing person, and then trying to see, what the fuck was going on with, each of your family members. And you weren't like digging in them too much, but you would like, at certain times you'd be like, hey, is shit going all right with this or that, da 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 da, you know, that's good that, things are, good and not, bad, if you ever, need something, let me fucking know or something like that, you know, you might not have been there, able to be there for me. You're like, no, I cannot help you right now. It ain't that I don't want to, it's just I can't do it right now. But you have that like way of like telling them at least and letting them know, whereas other people, might not, you know you have to like, do other things. But um this person, um doesn't necessarily, when they're around other people, they don't talk about their past too much. They say, like, again, they say what they need you to know about them. So like you ask about how many siblings they have. Four. It's just like simple to the point. It's four. um if like, they come across somebody that they like, jive with more, they may say like, names or whatever, but nothing like, it ain't anything in great detail with this person. It ain't. um And it don't mean that they don't like their family. It actually does, if they're like even acknowledging anything about that, um, is what it actually means. But they don't need to like keep. They're more so about like, you know, they themselves are, you know, in the family, you know, they're more concerned about that type of shit. And it don't mean that they don't, again, they don't care about their family and they don't say anything about their family. They just don't emphasize it as much. And like certain things about them, right, lets you know that they were like influenced, you know, somehow by like their mother or, you know, their family members. You know, you could just pick up on something that they do, you know, it's from their childhood, and you can just pick up on this. You know, there's some like dead giveaways. You know, with the Green Angel, you guys should know what, you know, I grew up on and shit. You know, as far as like, you know, some things go, right? Because I, you know, let you know that, you know, and just that, you know, that's all you gotta know. But the next sign is Taurus Mercury in the fourth house. So Taurus Mercury in the fourth house, they don't get loud. See, like the Aries Mercury might get loud at times and like, you know, get, you know, irritated and shit like that. But a Taurus Mercury, they don't. They will, you know, internalize that shit way more. If things didn't go right, you know, they might be around the family more when it's like cool, but like let's say, you know, something happened, you know, and somebody, you know, hurt their feelings and shit, they, you know, close themselves off and they don't say shit for a while. And like, you know, were you actually like in their mind, they're like, if you actually know who the fuck I am as your like, you know, family member, you'll know like what the fuck I do and like where you went wrong, and you have to come address this with me, you know, the proper way and shit like that. You know, their mother might have also been like, you know, you need to talk to people more, not because, because you just need to like do that. I can't always be here for you and tell you, you know, this or that, you know. And I know, and you know, your mother probably knows that you know what the fuck you're feeling or what you need to do or what you're thinking about, but you need to tell those people, you know, what the fuck's going on. You gotta like let these people know what, you know, going on. You can't just keep that to yourself and then like get upset that, you know, these people ain't doing or don't know something, you know, when you didn't tell them shit. You know, you gotta tell them something, you know. You know, and then it's like not your problem because you know you did what you had to fucking do. But you know, your mom, you know, tried to like, you know, probably also keep you around because you're, you know, also reliable and other things. You're more reliable than, you know, other people in the family and shit, right? You're actually one who is, you know, capable and, you know, not capable. Yeah. Um, you know, when you know, around other people, you also, you know, like you don't bring that shit up too much. You do it at the right times and shit with the right people. You don't just run around and talk about your family and shit like that, right? If it's brought up in conversation, you know, tell them, you know, kind of like the areas and shit. You know, you tell them what they need to know. You know, you try to like also. It ain't that you like try to steer away from that type of like conversation. It's more like you know, talk to them and you try to like emphasize certain like points. And what I mean by emphasize is you try to make them feel, you know, a little bit of like that. So like, let's say your mom like cooked for you and you love that part of it. You know, you would like say, you know, I love when my mom cooked, you know, this for me when I was a kid. And you would like kind of go on about that in conversation and shit, right? But it's not like, you know, you're trying to like glaze her or anything. It's just like something that's also like relatable and people are like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, I had a mom, or I wish I had a mom that was like that. Or you know, in conversations, you know, go, you know, other ways with, you know, a person like you. But you don't like not, you know, talk about them, but you don't like run around and tell everybody about them. You know, there'll be certain people you come around that you don't tell nobody like shit about them. Like I don't have family members, you know, and you might be lying, but you know, at the end of the day, you're doing it as like you want to protect your family. You don't want people, because like you don't want people finding your, you know, family members and shit. You don't give a fuck about that, like, because certain people you just know that you don't want to give them that shit to. You're like, no, you don't get to, like, I don't have any family members, and you do have family members, but you just like, no, man, I don't do that. And you do shit like that, and you tell them like nothing at all. It's like people who you're like comfortable with and are like friends, and like you see like traits of like maybe your brother, your mother, your mother, your siblings in these people that you're meeting, and then you're like comfortable enough to say shit like, yeah, I used to do shit like this with my brother, sister, or whatever. But you ain't just going off doing shit like that. You ain't doing that, because you're like one of those type of people. You're actually loyal to mom and family and shit like that, whether they might realize that or not. Like you might have had falling outs or whatever, but you still you don't do that. Now the next person is Gemini. Now Gemini is one who's like runs around and talks and shit, but they also like they had like back and forth conversations. They were the ones that like really talked to their parents and shit a lot. Um, like just all the time, like talking to them and yeah, learning from them, and, really just that's who they go to for like conversation. Like this just in them, like I know, like they be like, I know I need to talk to these people, or I have my friends and shit, but I just can't talk to anybody else right now. I need to talk to you, mom, or you, sister, or you, whoever that nurturing energy was in the house. I need to talk to you. I just can't talk to these other people. They don't get me on that kind of level. They don't talk about things on that kind of level, but you do. you know but you know and it's like a comfortability thing, and it's also they're used to like certain types of conversations being had, because when they would talk with their parents, they would talk about all kind of shit, not just like emotional stuff, but like they would plan shit with their parents. They would like go through like all kind of shit with them, you know uh different plans. Does this sound like a good idea type shit, and and they lay on like what the fuck they're thinking, and all that, like all that shit's like through them. And now let's say that they left their house and other things, they know, and their parents know too. My son, my daughter can like talk to anybody and get their point across. you know they they don't have no fucking issues as far as that shit goes. Now, they might not want to hang around, or they only talk to certain people so long because, well, damn, you might not be smart enough for them, right? This person likes to, take in information and send shit out. They could be gossipers, or whatever, or maybe they ain't gossipers, but it seems like that. But they also could be gossipers. you know they also, when they were growing up, would like let their parents know, hey, my brother is doing this right now. you so and so is also doing this right now. I heard that my brother was going to do this. I just wanted to let you know so you didn't flip out on them, or he didn't tell you or she didn't tell you, but I'm gonna let you know right now that's what they're doing. You know, and that's what this person does. They're kind of like a messenger and shit, right? For the family and elsewhere. When they find those people that they're finally like comfortable with, outside of shit like that, they still it's like those people that they're connected to now that ain't family members are still, it's like reminiscent of like somebody like their mother or their siblings and shit. And it's like I feel comfortable talking to you in that kind of way, because different people's life situations and shit, man, they don't have their families anymore for whatever reason, or like they had a falling out, or whatever the fuck. But they still like seek that type of like thing, you know um and when they do, they find a person who's like that, and they're like, damn, I used to have conversations like this with my da, 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 and then whatever happened happened. Hopefully we can come back together and continue to have conversations. But right now, I have to like, find, whoever, or, just keep shit, you know, because like these people are smart. They can tell by like what, they can tell where a conversation's heading when they like come upon somebody and they're like, okay, well, unfortunately, this person I can only, talk to about like the weather and shit. It's not like I can actually like plan things out, or they can challenge my mind and question, challenge me mentally like that. But anyways, somebody with Cancer Mercury, right? Cancer Mercury in the fourth house. This person, cares deeply about their family members, right? So, they're the types to be like, are you all right? Mom, are you all right, dad? And they always like make sure, because like they have that intuition, that innate, sense that, you know, okay, you might not have like said anything, but like you always ask and shit. You always ask, you like, are you okay? Are you actually doing all right? you know, you might be like, your parents might be trying to hide some shit from you, and you're the kid that like knows that shit, and you're like, because like you feel it, and you know that they're trying to like, keep something from you, either for your safety or whatever, and then they're like, no, don't worry about it, and they might emphasize like, no, don't worry about it, it's like just some shit that you don't gotta worry about, and they might just say, tell this kid, yeah, I'm just having a bad day, maybe, if that, they might just be like, the parents might have just been like, no, just stay the fuck away, and it's like none of your concern at all. They don't even like ask you about what's going on. You know, it depends on what kind of household they have growing up, but they always try to like, see like what kind of emotional state their family members in. They'll let their parents know and shit. Hey, I feel this way because these people did this shit to me, and I didn't, the way I react to it, I didn't like it. Pissed me the fuck off. It, did this, I had to distance myself, or I was gonna like really go the fuck off on someone, or I did go the fuck off on somebody, and now I'm like, regretting it or whatever, and they talk shit out with their family members, or their mom specifically, their mom talk them through, because like that's what this placement does. Is Mercury in the fourth house, that's connects to your mother, or like that person who's like your mother, if you had that and shit, and they talked you through these, things and shit. And then, like, when she's, like, gone or whatever, you still seek that type of, like, thing in conversations. Like, you seek, a person who not, like, because, like, you already can tell if somebody else is messed up, but you want to know that somebody else can, like, understand you, and you being in out of sorts type of emotions, right? You're depressed, or you're this or that, and like your parent also knew that about you too. They talked you through your negative shit, and got you right. Every time you talk to your mom, or your older sister, or whoever it was, they helped you out of that. You came to them with that shit, and they didn't like dust you off necessarily. Helped you through it, helped you work through that shit, and then you try to like you try to be that yourself, or you try to like find that in other people, a little bit of both. Um, and you are a person who doesn't necessarily like loud shit and other stuff typically, or you're a person that like understands there are people who are more, aggressive, loud, and you don't care, it's all about how they, make you, if they fuck with your emotional state or not, in a positive or negative way, and that's how you, make people. But you always, are like, my family and this and that. And you like talk to certain people about it, you know. But not everybody, you don't talk to everybody about it, you find the right people, and you are able to, find that you talk to people, because like you'll know if somebody, you'll ask, you'll be like, are you doing all right today? But only if they like pulled, they piqued your interest and shit, and then through conversation, then the conversation goes towards like, oh, my mom did this for me and this and that growing up, and then you're like, you find out about their family, and then you created a deeper connection with somebody else, but you always have that strong connection with your like roots and shit, like through like your mom and that type of thing. Typically not the father when it comes to the fourth house, unless he had to be like both for some reason. But we have Leo Mercury in the fourth house. So Leo Mercury in the fourth house, we got a guy or a female who likes to, talk, and let them know, what they like, dislike or not like, or like or dislike. I don't like this, mommy. Let's do this. I don't like this. Or let's not do this today. And trying to convince their parents to do this way or that way, and they're like, oh, and they might be able to like sway their parents every once in a while, or like all the time, depending on the situation and shit, right? Because they like know how to like talk also, good about them and get what they want, but this person, like they grow up that way, let's say their parents didn't do that though, and they like, every once in a while they do like love their kid and how they can like, speak up for themselves and shit like that, but they also got the belt a lot, this kid, then goes into like the next, part of their life, and they remember that they're like, now I shouldn't like, with certain people I should, say what I need to say, but I shouldn't expect that, like, like I should say what I need to fucking say, but I shouldn't um, necessarily expect that everybody will fucking, get what I'm trying to say, or jive with what I'm trying to fucking say. It's gonna be, I'm gonna have opposition, I'm gonna have that. That's what that actually taught them and shit. If they, seen shit right, or they come to find this shit out later, and I like, what, that's what it is. That's why I come across people who are cool as fuck, and they like, gravitate towards the shit that I'm talking about. We have a good time, but then there's other people who don't. They're just not like this. They are not, you know, like my family members. They of course want to see me do well, and see me, shine. Or certain family members though, might, secretly be jealous. You know, but because like I can, this person can like say what they, like say what they, intend to do, and then also, you know take action. They don't, they can be fixated on certain, I'll say, fun things, anything they find fun, anything they find, exciting. They are fixated on like their vision of what things should be like, but they also learned like from their mother, typically, that, you shouldn't speak, be loud, get your point across, but don't like always, emphasize shit, don't be arrogant when you speak type shit, because then people don't want to listen to that. They'll stop being around you. If you want people to stay around, like don't, do that. Also let them have, their time to talk, and then you listen to them, and then you can, you have the ability to essentially make shit better for everybody else. Because that's why people like being around you. You're a fun person, and that's who you want to be. You know, you want to brighten their life. You want to, bring their spirits up, but you can't just, get like that. And like your parent, your mom, your older sister, put you in your place and shit. Every once in a while. Then you became an adult, and you're more effective at, speaking to people. You know, and you now have friends and other shit, and you basically, credit that shit to like your upbringing. And you might say it here and there again, but you're like, you're still of, that type of mindset where, you are that person who's like making shit happen, but you still give credence and credit to, your past every once in a while. You're like, oh, my mom, told me that, I shouldn't, be too arrogant when I speak to people sometimes, or like ever, because, I won't be able to like, get my point across, right? and then you like emphasizing that with somebody who's like, might be of like fire signage and like has those kind of issues too, but you're like bringing that up so like they learn, that they'll be more effective if they ain't so arrogant, and it might be sometimes you are, but you gotta remember what they, taught you, not to do that shit, because people don't like that. And if you're trying to target like certain people, you can't be that way. Um, and yeah, that's that person, right? So this next person is Virgo Mercury in the fourth house. Virgo Mercury in the fourth house. This person, when they were growing up, they picked up on details and shit, right? And they would like talk and ask questions and be like, I see that over there, but when I see that over there, I see this, that, and third. Their parents might have been impressed about how much shit that this kid saw, where you was picking up on things that I would like basically glance over. She would pick up on shit that I would glance over. My son or daughter is like very analytical, very detail oriented, just naturally, you know and that's how this person's mind works. And then going forward, it's like you know this person, they would like be like, maybe, you know, be that way yourself, but also understand that and don't let, because you are somebody who like thinks things through a lot. Don't let the fact that they can't think things through move you in any kind of like way off your path, because you were just naturally a person who sees the finer details and more analytical. You take a more methodical approach to doing shit. Other people just don't do shit like that. They don't, and their mom emphasized this shit with them. So like they wouldn't like, if they're trying to like go about like maybe having friends and shit, they need to like be that person in the group, but like also be okay with your friends ain't gonna like see shit that you see. You know, see problems that you see clear as day. They ain't gonna see it. You know, maybe don't try to like nitpick people too much. Because this person might have had that fucking issue growing up. And that's why they got into fights with their siblings and shit. But then it's like you have to like be give that shit to them in the right kind of way. Yes, you're nitpicking them, but you're doing it because you don't want to see them fail. That type of thing. Not, oh, you're a dumbass because you didn't see da 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 da. You know, hey, did you ever think about when you see that, right? There's all this that's still wrong with it. These things need tweaked a little bit. Once you fix that, you're good. You can be that type of person instead of a person who's like, you know, just like nitpicking at shit to like be an asshole. You know, because like people don't always like think like you, and like that was emphasized on you and shit with your like mom and shit. You are a person who can think shit through, but other people ain't. So you have to like be that person who's there for them, but also if they don't want you around, you can't don't ever don't drop yourself down to their level is basically what they she probably emphasized to you. And that's how you end up being a guy who or a female who's like, well, very successful and don't like fuck around that much, because your parents, especially your mom, was like, my kid ain't gonna be somebody who like falls into like these traps and shit like that. They already see this shit coming, and they can they already understand, or know, and can communicate well, and they see shit that other people don't see. They can communicate pretty decently as well. You know, and then when it comes to like finding people and shit, it's like finding the right people. You know. and for this person is out this person, finding people who are, around, like, who allow themselves to be critiqued, you know, not just for, this person to, like, but because this person actually sees shit in their life that they could fix. And then, like, they're just doing that because they want to be a friend, or whatever, and they ain't gonna, like, get sideways with this person about, like, them bringing up, things that they need to work on, and another thing. But, like, this person knows how to find the right people. Obviously, somebody who's, like, getting sideways about, little remarks I've made about, maybe they should try to do this or that, you know. But somebody who's also, like, like, oh, I'll consider, that's somebody who, like, maybe be friends with, because they're actually considering, changing and, finding themselves in that kind of way. But I get on to the next sign. This is, Libra, Mercury in the fourth house. Libra, Mercury in the fourth house. This was a sweet talker. This person, was smart too. They knew how to, like, read books and, like, do good, and, talk to, people with, respect. You know, um, you know, if they are, dissing people, they are also still not dissing them and shit. They'll still be like, I was just telling you that, because I believe you need to know that, because, you know, out of the goodness of their heart or whatever, right? Because it's Libra. But, like, they speak in a calm and cool manner, right? Like, when they talk, they ain't too loud, or, too, emphasizing anything too much. They really, don't. Um, typically, but sometimes, like, let's say this person has, like, a Leo sun, and then they are like that, they're gonna emphasize shit, but they're, like, also, trying to find, like, they're trying to, like, give you some type of, like, information and shit. They're trying to, like, make sure you, right, and you and whoever the fuck are on the same page. They had that kind of relationship with their mother and shit too. They were like, I'm gonna, yeah, like, mom, I'm gonna go hang out with these people, or sister, I'm gonna go hang out with these people. You know, this is, and then, like, they told him and shit. They're like, this is so and so, you met him the other day, or this is, this person, we met, a couple of days ago. All the information that they would need, and I was like, okay, son or daughter, go do that with so and so, or you can't do that with so and so today. Let's do that another day. And then they, but they would, try to negotiate, because these people can do shit like that, right? They may have tried to negotiate with, like, okay, but, we can't do this, because we can't do it later, because, it's only happening one time, and trying to, do that, but maybe, they still couldn't go or whatever, but, they still always tried to, have that back and forth with, their parents and shit, right? Let them know shit. And, they try not to, take that shit too hard and other things. But, once they became adults, they could, do shit like that. But even then, they still had that connection with their parents and shit. So they're like, still, call, it's ingrained in them, oh, well, I'll call mom, or, my sister, and see what they're doing. Let's say, because, like, they're done fucking around with their friends or whatever, doing their thing with them, because they probably were doing shit with, like, some friends, or at least, talking to, like, coworkers or something. They're like, they always find time in their day to call their, family members, and, and see what's up with them, or, like, their mom or whoever, and just, say something, hey, I'm over here and I'm doing this, just letting you know what the fuck's going on, you know, and that's how these people's minds work and shit, right? And it came up from the, mom, like, son, baby girl, let me know what the fuck's going on. And they would always do that, and it was conditioned. And then by the time they, grew up, they were, like, good at talking to people, and, getting their points across, and, doing all that, like, getting information about people, and, knowing where people are in relation to, what's going on in the environment, and, all kind of shit. They still have that connection with their mom, and, like, communication is, important with this person. And it was, like, emphasized in childhood too. So moving forward, when they have kids, they'll also be like, let me know what the fuck's going on, you know, talk to me, a little bit, let me know what's going on, every once in a while, because it's good to do that. Some people are on the same page. Um, and yeah, so the next person is, Scorpio, Mercury in the fourth house. So this person, you know, they have emotional ties to their family members. They think about their family members. They think about shit like, how is this going to affect my family members, sometimes, like, because this is in the fourth house. I want to do this, but it's also like, I don't want shit coming back on them necessarily. And I will, because this person is kind of like that, um, they understand that their actions are their actions type shit. It's not, other people's. But at the same time, this person, also can be affected by people. And, if they, get fixated on a certain emotion, that could be, a positive one or a negative one, depending on what the fuck's going on. And their parents knew this about them. You know, they could be, stuck in a rut for a while, or they could, be, god damn, just, damn, you getting like all of that shit done. You told me you were gonna do this. You weren't, too fucking like, scared or anything. You weren't letting shit stop you. But you also weren't like loud about shit. You weren't like, you would say it here and there, like, oh, I'm gonna be fuck, I'm gonna be, the best athlete I can be, you know, on the team. I'm gonna, support my team. I'm gonna do that shit. And your parents were probably like, yeah, you keep showing up. You keep showing up. That's good. That's good. And that good reinforcement was good. But then when it came time for like, negative reinforcement to come in, you were more, aggressive and shit, because like the way they were saying shit to you was, aggressive. So you then, had that energy, and you stuck with that kind of vibe, and you also could tell, like, because this person's a little more intuitive than other people, when shit was wrong with, your, parents. But also, you are a fixed sign though, so if you were not on the same page and like emotionally, you would seek that type of, connection somewhere else. All, but still, like, being like, you would still like go out for them. You would still, you know talk on their behalf, or, if you needed to, or, see what the fuck was, going on, at times, but you're also that person who's, driven towards like their own desires and their own ambitions, whatever that might be. And like you emphasize, like, or like they like your parents knew that you were like that, so they ain't gonna like stop you and shit. They actually can't stop you, you know but they would do the best they could while you were with them and shit, you know and they did that because they knew that you had that volatileness to you. Certain times when shit don't go your way, you might not like lash out right away, but like you would be like closed off, and then like shit would still pour over, and you would like, you would just randomly, beat somebody's ass, or, get into fights and shit, but they knew that about you, and they were like, hey, don't let people, get you fixated on, shit like that, maybe, and if they do, end that shit, and, get on to what you gotta do, like get on to like your real mission, whatever the fuck that is. And like, you know because like they knew you're like, you have drive, you have, purpose, you ain't gonna let shit slow you down. You won't let shit slow you down. But, sometimes would, get to being like, I think I need to like slap you. I need to like grab you, just because they make me, feel some type of way. And like, you don't always have to do it. Kind of pick your battles and shit. But then, you know, um, but yeah, man, you people, do care about your family members. You think about them, and if anything bad would happen, you would, be there to like, end shit or whatever, But and that's just the way this person thinks. They could be a Sagittarius, but when they get silent, because like Sagittarius typically ain't silent necessarily, but when they get silent, they're thinking, well, damn, what are their like, what are these people's true motives and shit? Are they, this way or that way? I gotta watch their actions a little better. And that was another thing that was, probably talked on. You know, watch people's actions, not their words. If you like fixate on like how they say shit and other things, they'll control you, or they'll influence you to like, get upset and lash out at them. But if you like watch their actions, you'll just be like, oh, well, they're saying this, but really they're the ones who are actually out of sorts, and that's why they talk to me that way. And they learn that shit too. So the next sign is Sagittarius Mercury in the fourth house. Sagittarius Mercury in the fourth house. They knew, yeah, their mom knew that by the time they were like gone, they'd be young. They'll be, out the door doing all kinds of shit, fucking with these people, fucking with those people, living life to their fullest. She probably had to like, put him in, time out when she had to, or him or her, because this could be a female too. They're just their mind is like, they're impatient, right? They like to make shit happen right away. Like if they think something and they like, get like fixated on or that thought, or basically that thought is something that they like really like, like and want to like go after. They ain't gonna wait. They're gonna like make sure that shit happens. They'll be like, okay, yeah, I can, do that. You know, they might have been told, don't do shit like that because it's not the best decision to do or whatever. That might be enticing or whatever. But maybe they were being talked out of shit. And not because that was necessarily wrong, but it probably was wrong too. At that time in their life, they shouldn't have been doing shit like that. Now later on, while they're adults, by all means, try that shit out. But right now, boy, you can't do shit like that. You only you're only 9 years old, boy. You gotta chill the fuck out. You want me to bring this, and they're telling them, don't do that. You're still, you're getting ahead of yourself, a bit, and they didn't like seeing their like. It was cool that their kid was like, courageous or like, daring or whatever. But at the same time, that shit you should kind of worry about when they're like in their like youth and shit, like really young. But like by the time they come to high school and shit, I don't have to worry about my son or my daughter because they already, have that sense of about them, and they lead their own life, like, and they're, seeking the things they're interested in, you know, they ain't afraid to like get their point across to people or any of that either. I might have had to, and their parents might have had to nip them in the bud here and there for talking out of turn, but I know now that in any situation they'll tell it like it is to like who they need to, and like they'll let that shit fly, and it's good, because it lets those people know that they are fucking up. They ain't gonna just let that eat at them or anything. They'll let them know right then and there. They'll be like, hey man, I don't like this shit, and da, 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 da. Or hey man, I do like that shit, keep doing that, I fuck with it, you know and they didn't have to like worry about them like as much, in that kind of way. But earlier on, they kind of had to like grab them and shit and tell them like, wow, and teaching them, certain opportunities shouldn't be seized right away. You might just be getting ahead of yourself. Maybe, you know, for these people, and they learn that type of thing. Like their mind works like that, and like sometimes they have to like they can seize those opportunities, but they shouldn't you know, get too excited too quickly. you know, and they learn that because their parents and shit. But and also when they do talk how they need to, that everybody ain't gonna always be like, oh, happy that they said oh, you said I'm a dumbass because of this and that. They ain't gonna be so friendly with you now because of that. And as long as you understand shit like that, okay, you know keep saying shit like that. Keep talking to people that way. And you might come across people who, like that, or people who don't, but you know you can't be doing that shit here when you're living with me, your dad. you know and they put that on them. And then with that there, they're like, they might every once in a while not do that, but they still have that about them. They just can't. They're like, who am I kidding? You are just some stupid, da, 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 da. I can't keep that shit to myself. But the next person is, Capricorn, Mercury in the fourth house. This person talked to their parents about planning for like the future and like, what's the best moves I can like do, daddy and mommy, where should I like work? If I, do this type of thing, you know, this or that, their parents emphasize that shit with them. You have a good job, you get a, job, you work hard, you stay disciplined, you manage your money correctly, because I know you like to like plan shit out, you know, execute the plan, and you execute a plan too. Like when you once you write something out, you execute it like then. You don't like wait on shit either. You're that type of person. You get shit done. And that's a good thing. That's something. And they was probably emphasized, you're a person who like is just a fucking guy who like, man, does shit. And you ain't also, the actions speak for themselves and shit. You don't have to like get upset that people don't see, and their parents had to teach them that too. That people don't see, the work you're putting in and shit. Because at first it's like, not recognizable, but like after a while, that shit builds up, and then like you don't have to say a fucking thing. Your actions, what you have done, speaks for themselves. And their parents, told them shit like that because they knew they had that drive, that ambition in them. And they worked hard, and were willing to do things that other people weren't willing to do because they just ain't that kind of like tough. They don't have that kind of like grit. You know, this was the type of kid that like got hurt, would get up and not be too whiny about it. And the parents liked that, but they also didn't want this kid to get into fights and shit because of that. I'm tough. You guys are kind of weak as fuck or whatever. You, people won't do anything. You won't do shit. You know, being like that, you can't be like that. You have to like be like that, but like you have to be the example first. So like you have to have the things like to show that you're like that, and then be like that, and then you're a person who like people can then like go to and shit. I want to make my next steps for like doing this and doing that. I know this person has taken those steps because they don't they have a sense of urgency about them when they set out to do something. They get on that shit when they're locked in and shit. um and like they tell them also their parents probably said or their mom, people get emotional. You're not necessarily emotional, but you might get sideways with people when you're bringing up real things that are going on and real issues that are like happening, and they ain't seeing it. You will get out of sorts as the Capricorn Mercury. You'll get out of sorts, because they just don't get it. They don't see what's really going on, but you do. You just gotta like understand that those people. You just gotta let them like be them, I guess. Let them know what the fuck. is really going on. But it's on them if they can't or refuse to see shit for what it is. It ain't your job to like be there and be like, no, 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 and like tell them that shit and try to be like their dad and shit. Like if they don't want to, let them do that. But let them know. Like let them know. But if you feel like you need to, but like don't, stick around because then you'll be wasting your own time. And that's just like time you can't get back. That's time you could have had, grinding for like more. And that's what they learned, from their, parents and shit. That's why they are like that. I don't fuck around with this or that. I go to work. I work hard, and I might play hard on the side, but right back to work. I'd rather not, get caught up in shit like that. They had like good parents. I don't know. These people were, kind of, not cool, but they, get shit done. They have like that kind of mindset. I'll have a plan and I'll execute it right then and there. And I'll also make sure I have my shit together before I'm like dictating or um like trying to have somebody else do something. I'm not gonna say some shit when I haven't done it. I would actually have to like done shit myself, and then I'll like tell somebody that. Now the next the next sign is Aquarius Mercury in the fourth house. So Aquarius Mercury in the fourth house, you or also somebody who kind of sees things for what they are, but you like think of ideas and like how to like change people's like mindset, or like maybe not change people's mindset, or have them see something that they probably didn't see before, consider something they might not have, had you not like been the person you are, and you were like, hey man, did you ever think of like this or that, and posing these fancy questions to your parents, and they're like, see, but earlier on you might have had like some like weirder ideas that weren't really ideas, but that's just like silly shit. Like don't say that. Like that's not actually, like, let's say, oh my gosh, let's say that you wanted to um not all you know not all phones need phone chargers to charge. You're saying shit like that when you're like young. Like, they don't all need phone chargers to charge, and you're like some little boy and shit, like really young and shit, and they're like, what do you mean? And then you're like, but because like you can it can just charge itself, and you like have the idea, but you don't like have enough evidence or anything like that to like actually have a like real conversation, but you like on the right track. So later on you're older and shit, and you actually read books and like done some research, right? And you're like trying to figure out a way to create, and because like I need somebody to like hear this shit, make a phone charger, right? So like you plug it in to the charging port, it picks up on the Wi-Fi connection, and then that Wi-Fi connection, that energy is shot through the phone, and it creates, a charging mechanism as well. And it's just something you plug in to the bottom, and you're like posing this idea to your parents and shit, and they're like, I don't know, maybe not now, but and you think you're the one who's gonna be able to like get this shit off the ground. You gotta know, and their parents are telling them like, you gotta know this and that, you know, maybe it's not, far fetched, but it's not something that's actually being done right now, you know, and like money and shit, like how much is this shit gonna cost and other things, you know, you gotta know all this, learn all this shit, beforehand. But then like by the time like they like, cause like this is Mercury, right? This is Aquarius Mercury in the fourth house. you know their parents basically didn't discourage them, but like at first was like you need to like have like more you know evidence, or information. This is, and then they have the information. Like, you still need to go deeper. It's kind of like encouragement a little bit, and then they like, and even if it is like, their parents were like, oh, that shit's just not possible, just use the charger and like don't even fucking think about shit like that, telling them like shit like that, they would still go against the grain and be like, fuck that, we're gonna figure out how to make, like, they'll even be more so like that, I'll be the one to fucking make this charger and like revolutionize this shit, kind of, because like now you can just plug in, a thing, pick up on a Wi-Fi connection, and like niggas have, when people have, their phone being charged off of a, Wi-Fi connection. You just stay in that area and you can have your phone charged. Take it off. When you're done, your phone's charged and everything, right? But you gotta learn all those like mechanisms from like, how a phone charger works. And how, Wi-Fi works, and then bringing those and integrating those things together, into like one device, one, charger that can, like, and then the pricing for that, how much does it take to make one of those things and all this shit, and this hasn't happened yet, people, but I hope somebody listens to this video and makes that shit happen. Remember this video and shit, because by the time, like, that shit happens, I'll be like, hey boy, the guy was talking about shit like that before. He has a moon sign in Aquarius, the Green Angel does. So he did, want that person to like get behind and do that shit. No matter if your mama or your daddy told you that shit. This is like this part of the video is like my own personal thing. You know, make that charger for me. But it's like these type of people who think that way, who, do that, who change the world for like the better and shit. And I'm like, right now the Green Angel needs that shit, because like I'm out here, and I don't, have, a charger sometimes, but I could charge my phone while I'm connected to the internet, and it will charge my phone as I'm like sitting in a, cafe, or sitting in an area that's a public area, you know. I don't know, that, could, be a thing in the future. It's not out of the realm of possibility. And these people, think like that, and their parents, either like, they talk back and forth with their mom, or like whoever their like, parental figure was, that was more nurturing, and like, heeded calls to them and shit, right? To some degree, and it was like, I'll listen to what my, kid has to say. And they're like, yeah, you have to, but in order to do shit like that, you have to, put the work in, and, make sure you know all that stuff. I don't not believe in you, but you gotta like also, put the work in, and, learn all that shit. And you have the ability to do that, because you keep bringing it up, as, Mercury sign that's extroverted, right? That's Aquarius Mercury, and let's say this person don't talk that much, but when they, have that idea, they're like, oh, hey, da 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 da, and they're like running all this kind of information by you, and then they're like, well, damn, why don't you just do that then? Because I don't think anybody else is, on that kind of timing, you know. The next person and the last person I'm gonna talk about is Pisces Mercury in the fourth house. So this person cares about their parents and other people to some degree. They'll let their parents know if, they're feeling bad and other shit. And they also, in turn, are like, because they know what they're feeling like and shit. They're saying, well, mommy and daddy, are you feeling all right? You know, Um, I feel great, but you guys, might be, out of sorts for whatever reason, and, more than likely their parents might be like, you don't know shit because, you are not an adult. You don't get it. They might just tell the kid to be quiet and go somewhere else, or they, it could be, no, daddy's just, this way, I'll be okay. You worry about yourself. And if anything's wrong with you, you let dad or your mommy know, and whatever, the main thing here about this person is when they were a kid, they could pick up on other people's, emotional state, and then like, it was kind of in them to like want to like understand that, or understand why they're like that, and try to fix it. These people kind of have that kind of thing earlier on a little bit. you know but they also want that, in return as well. They want somebody to like, if they're out of sorts, they want them to like, even if I'm not saying anything, even if this person ain't saying shit, that something's wrong with me. It lets me know that you care, and that you actually, know what's going on when, other people don't. This person, does shit like that, right? And they like know how to talk, with some, they know how to get their point across. These people definitely do. And they talk sweet, they talk, you know, in a way that, is impactful. They ain't necessarily loud with what they say, but their words, it's like one of those things where they talk little, but those few words have a lot of meaning and shit behind it. And they're like, oh shit, this kind of person kind of sounds wise. Um, you know, because they've like met different kind of people, and like, earlier on their parents might have been like, do not like seek certain people and shit, like just let them fucking be. Like these people will like fuck you up. They'll have your aura all fucked up, like maybe not your aura, but they'll just have your state of mind all fucked up. If you hang around those type of friends, Johnny or whatever, you'll be all fucked up. I don't need you hanging around them. They still have that curiosity, or that, sense of like, I want to, seize that opportunity, kind of like a Sagittarius. And they like, but they internalize it because it's Pisces and shit. And they're like, okay, and they might even like still do shit, but then they like look back and they're like, oh fuck, that's why. Well, that's why they told me not to do that, because I feel like shit now. you know, but that's where that like wisdom part then comes in, and then like later when they see another person, they're like, hey man, trust me when I say, you know, my parent told me not to do this type of thing. I ended up doing it, and it caused me to feel this way, you know. But like this person also knows like that type of shit. Like they still wanted to like, go out and experience that, so they might say shit like, I wouldn't do that if I were you, but if you still insist on doing it, go right ahead. Because like their actions were the same way essentially. Like they were told not to do it, they decided to do it anyways. They felt bad. Something negative happened, but they learned. For them, that feeling they didn't want to feel. They didn't want somebody else to feel similarly. And they was like, letting them know that, if you do shit like that, you're gonna, feel, and like the world's gonna be like, fucked up for you for a little bit. You might, things might go south. You might be in a rut for a while if you do shit like that. But like, they're also not gonna like, stop them, because they themselves would still, try new things. But anyways, and their parents like knew, um, like, okay, you did that shit when I told you not to. What's the lesson learned here now, right? Maybe you shouldn't, do certain things. Um, but you also are a person who like, does shit anyways and other things. But you now have that to teach your like siblings, or whatever. You know, you did that. You know, you can tell them to like not fucking do it, because this shit will, come back, and hit you like this. Kind of scare them away from doing shit like that. But if it's like somebody else that they don't really like care about, like they don't care, like maybe they, they just don't care as much, because they know that people are, people, because they are, they do have some kind of wisdom and shit, right? Because you get wisdom from like experiencing different things, and being able to like reflect back on and shit. And that's what they do and shit. And they're like, hey man, I wouldn't do that, or I wouldn't suggest doing shit like that. I've done this before and it made me feel this way, or like these actions and have consequences for this. But also there also like you still have that decision to make yourself. I can't stop you, but I'm also gonna let you know what happened with me. Um, but they become those kind of people. They listen, to some degree, but then they don't when they like really are enticed by somebody's energy, and their parents know this about them essentially, and they're like don't fall for that shit, and then they do, and but they gain wisdom, and they you know, then tell their parents, later on when they're adults, like had I not done that, I might not have been able to like, learn those kind of things. And then that, they kind of like show some like, maturity, things that their parents might not have, had the guts to do and lost to do, they did. And, maybe their parents are like, damn, well, you know, guess what? I guess you have, more balls than I guess not do, you know, but it takes time and other things, and this person always had that intuition about people, so like they also knew that shit was gonna go south, to some degree. They had a feeling, but they were also like, I want to try to like go against that, or like change that, because like I might just be out of sorts myself, but it was really them not, I don't know, they knew what was gonna come their way, but they just took it on anyways. Then they gained some wisdom. Um, anyways, that was the Mercury in the fourth house is told by Darius the Green Angel. Be cool on the corner, and let me know if you want a natal reading from me. I make these things. Where I have your sun sign, moon sign. You know, your rising sign. I get your, Mercury sign and all that shit, where, which house it's in, and it's specialized for you because you're gonna give me your, birth date. You're gonna give me your uh, place of birth, and then the time you were born. Time as in AM, PM type shit. Um, and then I'm gonna write that up for you. I'll send that to you on like Google Docs, and like it's a document that has all your shit on it. And it's like I have the the astrological wheel on there, and then I have it in chart form, and then I tell you, and I write down, what each sign means, because like you have specific degrees, and like I haven't even made videos on that yet, but I'll make videos about that in the future. But be cool, call on the corner, and wait for some more videos to come out.